Explain why the Nazis were able to construct a dictatorship between 1933 and 1939. You may use the following in your answer: the Reichstag fire of 1933, the Enabling Act of 1933. You must also use information of your own. 12 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. Now, we know that 6 marks are available for AO2, which is your analysis of causation. Remember that the question has asked you to explain why. That means that you need to think about the factors and things, events, developments that led to this. So what do you think caused it? Now, you can use the 2 stimulus points given to you in the question. You don't have to, but you can. Just remember though that if you do use them, it's also really important that you use evidence of your own knowledge, because if you only use the stimulus points, you hit what's called a mark ceiling, and that means that you can't actually score in the higher bands if you're only using the information given to you in the question. That brings us on to AO1, which is also worth 6 marks, and that is for you bringing in your knowledge and understanding of the period. When you're bringing in these factors, you need to show the examiner that you know the topic really well to explain this causation. Here are the bottom 2 bands for this question. Now, you might notice that we're seeing words like straightforward, not developed, general, lack of organisation. That means that maybe you've listed some factors that contributed to this event, but you haven't really explained them. So to show the examiner that you know the topic really well, you need to explain that factor in enough detail. That might mean bringing in evidence from your own knowledge to just expand on it a little bit, maybe making comments that take that factor and link it back to the question. In terms of organisation, it should be quite easy for the examiner to follow, so quite a nice logical structure where you move from one factor to the next to the next. Also, if you're scoring in these 2 bands, it might mean that you haven't brought in enough of your own knowledge. Remember what we said about the stimulus points. It's great to use them, but just make sure that you're showing the examiner that you know the topic well enough to bring in bits of information from the stuff that you already know. These are the top 2 bands. Now here we're seeing words like analytical, consistently directed to the question, coherent, logical. So firstly, in order to be analytical, you need to have stated the factor that you think was an important cause and then explained it. So you've brought in bits of your own knowledge. You've explained why that caused the event. So make it really clear what you're arguing. That then will make it much easier for the examiner to follow your structure, to really understand what you're arguing. That way, the examiner knows that you know this topic really well. You're confident enough with the material to make a really well-justified argument, and one that analyses exactly what the question has asked you to do. There are many points you could make here, so as long as what you say is relevant to the question and correct, the examiner will award you the marks. But let's take a look at an example. So if you wanted to build upon the stimulus point of the Enabling Act, you can bring in your own knowledge to show the examiner that you know what you're talking about and use it to make a nicely developed point. So you might say that it allowed Hitler to pass laws without the approval of Parliament or the President, as set out in the Weimar Constitution. And that in turn allowed him to build a dictatorship because it gave him so much power. You can see there that if I'd only used the stimulus point, I would have been staying in the lower bands, but because I brought in my own knowledge, because I've linked it back to the question and made a nicely developed point with it, then I've shown that I've analysed what the question's asked me to do and therefore can score in the higher bands. Do take a look at the rest of the points here though to see if there's anything else you could have added to your answer.